When we speak about wisdom, most people imagine it as a mountain we climb, a peak we must reach, and once we are at the top, we can see everything clearly. But the truth is far deeper, far humbler, and far more profound. The journey of wisdom does not begin at the summit, but at the very first step, when we admit something most people struggle to say, "I don't know." That simple recognition, the courage to acknowledge our limitations, is the true foundation of wisdom. Socrates, the great philosopher of Athens, shook the world not because he claimed to have all the answers, but because he admitted he had none. When the oracle of Delphi declared him the wisest man alive, Socrates himself laughed and said, "If I am wise, it is only because I know that I know nothing." This humility became the cornerstone of his greatness. It may sound like weakness to admit ignorance, but in truth, it is the highest form of strength. When we say, "I don't know," we free ourselves from the prison of arrogance. Think of a cup already full of water. Nothing more can be poured into it. A mind that thinks it knows everything is already full, unable to receive anything new. But an empty cup, like the mind that humbly admits it does not yet have all the answers, can be filled with knowledge, insight, and truth. That is why the ancient Greeks admired questioning more than answering. Socrates never stopped asking questions, not to show off his intelligence, but to reveal how little any one of us can truly claim to know. And through those questions, he inspired generations to think more deeply, to search more sincerely, and to discover truths hidden beneath the surface. History shows us that those who cling to false certainty often blind themselves, while those who embrace humility open the door to true learning. Let us look at an example from ancient China. Confucius, one of the greatest teachers the world has ever known, often reminded his students that wisdom begins when we realize how much we still have to learn. He said, "Real knowledge is to know the extent of one's ignorance." He did not claim to have divine insight or perfect understanding. Instead, he approached life as a student, always refining, always questioning, always striving to understand the human heart, society, and virtue a little better each day. That spirit of humility is why his teachings still echo across centuries, shaping cultures far beyond his own. Even in ancient India, humility was revered as the root of learning. In the great epics and Vedic traditions, the guru would never accept a student who approached with pride. Only those who came with humility, with the awareness that they did not yet know, were considered worthy of being taught. One story tells of a young prince who approached a wise sage for instruction. The sage asked him, "What have you learned so far?" The prince proudly listed his skills, his knowledge of weapons, his understanding of governance, his training in philosophy. The sage only smiled and said, "You are too full of what you think you know. Return when you can come as an empty vessel, and then you will be ready to receive wisdom." That lesson remains timeless. We cannot receive the treasures of truth if our hearts are already filled with pride. Acknowledging ignorance is not about weakness. It is about clarity. Think of the ancient mathematician Pythagoras. He did not pretend to understand the universe completely. Instead, he approached it with awe. He admitted that much was still unknown, and that very humility drove him to seek patterns in numbers, harmony in music, and order in the cosmos. His discoveries still shape mathematics and philosophy today. If he had pretended to know it all, he would never have searched, never discovered, never left a legacy that reached far beyond his lifetime. Now imagine the opposite, those who refuse to admit what they do not know. Arrogance has toppled kings and silenced empires. In ancient times, rulers who believed they were beyond question fell into ruin. Think of pharaohs who declared themselves gods, only to watch their kingdoms decline because they would not listen to counsel, would not admit limitations, would not humble themselves before truth. Pride blinds, but humility opens the eyes. Those who admit they do not know stand ready to see, while those who believe they know it all remain trapped in darkness. When we admit our limitations, something beautiful happens. We begin to grow. A humble heart is like fertile soil. It allows seeds of wisdom to take root and flourish. A proud heart is like dry, cracked ground, incapable of nurturing anything new. The ancients understood this. That is why Socrates did not write books filled with his answers. He left behind dialogues, questions that forced others to think for themselves. He knew wisdom is not about storing information, It is about cultivating humility so that we remain forever open to greater understanding. And so, humility becomes the first step, the beginning without which the journey of wisdom cannot exist. To admit, "I don't know," is not to confess defeat, it is to declare readiness. It is to say, "I am open to learning, I am open to growing, I am open to becoming more than I was yesterday." That is why true wisdom begins with knowing you know nothing, for only then do you create space for something greater to enter. But humility alone is not enough. Once we admit our ignorance, we must not stop there. We must fuel that emptiness with curiosity, with a hunger to learn, with the courage to ask and seek. That is where the journey continues, because the second step in true wisdom is not only admitting what we don't know, but also nurturing the relentless desire to discover what we can. Once we embrace humility and admit how little we truly know, a door opens before us. But it is not enough to simply recognize our ignorance. We must allow that realization to awaken in us something powerful: curiosity. For curiosity is the fire that drives the human spirit to learn, to grow, to stretch beyond the limits of what is known and step into the unknown. Without curiosity, humility would leave us in silence. But with curiosity, humility becomes the spark that lights the path toward discovery. From the very beginning of human civilization, the greatest minds were not those who claimed to possess all knowledge, but those who questioned relentlessly, who allowed their ignorance to stir in them a deep hunger to seek truth. Aristotle, one of Socrates' most famous intellectual descendants, carried this torch forward. He did not stop at accepting that he did not know everything. He became a student of life itself. He studied plants, animals, politics, poetry, and the heavens. He asked why birds migrate, why leaves change, why societies thrive or collapse. His curiosity stretched across every field of human experience, and because of it, he became a father of philosophy and science. His work reminds us that curiosity transforms the emptiness of "I don't know" into the fullness of discovery. Curiosity is not merely a mental exercise, it is a way of living. In ancient India, scholars of the great Nalanda University embodied this spirit. They gathered from across the world, China, Greece, Persia, Tibet, not because they believed they had all the answers, but because they were united by questions. They debated, they discussed, they challenged one another, always fueled by the desire to learn. It was said that these debates could last for days, with no victor declared, because the purpose was not to conquer an opponent, but to uncover deeper truths. This shows us something timeless when curiosity guides us. Knowledge does not become a weapon of pride, but a bridge toward understanding. Even in ancient Egypt, the pursuit of wisdom was grounded in curiosity. The priests and scholars who studied the stars were not content to simply admire the night sky. They asked, what patterns exist here? What rhythms govern the movements of the sun and moon? That curiosity gave birth to some of the earliest forms of astronomy and calendars that shaped how civilizations organized time itself. Imagine what would have happened if they had simply said, "The heavens are beyond us, there is no need to question," they would have remained in darkness. But because they asked, because they sought, humanity took a leap forward. Curiosity is also what allows us to turn failure into growth. In the story of Archimedes, the great mathematician of ancient Greece, curiosity pushed him to explore how objects interact with water. His experiments led him to discover the principle of buoyancy. This was not the result of claiming certainty, but of continually asking, observing, and testing. His discoveries remind us that progress is born not from those who stand still, but from those who allow their ignorance to move them forward with questions. What curiosity does most beautifully is keep the mind alive. It prevents us from becoming stagnant, from thinking that we have arrived at the end of learning. Socrates himself never stopped asking questions, not even when faced with death. His dialogues were endless not because he sought to frustrate others, but because he wanted to awaken in them the same restless curiosity that drove him. In his final days, as he prepared to drink the hemlock, he was still inquiring about the immortality of the soul, still questioning, still curious about what awaited beyond life. That is the power of a questioning spirit. It does not fade with age, nor does it end with knowledge. It continues until the last breath. Curiosity is also what allows us to listen deeply. When we admit that we do not know everything, Our questions become invitations. We open ourselves to hear the experiences of others, to learn from their journeys. In the dialogues of ancient Athens, Socrates would often draw wisdom out of ordinary citizens simply by asking them questions. A craftsman, a soldier, a poet, all became teachers in their own way because Socrates was curious enough to listen. Imagine if each of us carried that spirit today. Imagine if we were curious not only about books and ideas, but about people, about their lives, their struggles, their dreams. How much wisdom we would gain if we approached others not as competitors to prove wrong, but as sources of insight to learn from. This is the true gift of curiosity. It transforms life into an endless classroom. Every challenge becomes a lesson. Every failure becomes an experiment. Every conversation becomes an opportunity to learn. Those who live with curiosity never grow old in spirit, because there is always something new to discover, something greater to seek. It is not about filling the mind with facts, but about keeping the flame of wonder alive. And so, if humility is the foundation, then curiosity is the journey itself. Humility clears the ground, and curiosity begins to build. But as we walk further, another truth emerges: to remain curious is to remain open. To truly grow, we must not only ask questions, but also open ourselves to the answers that come from places we may not expect. It is not enough to be curious if we refuse to hear, if we shut out voices that challenge us. That is why the next step in wisdom requires something equally vital: the openness to diverse perspectives, the courage to admit that truth may not come from where we expect, and that others, too, carry fragments of wisdom we cannot find alone. Curiosity awakens the desire to seek. But the journey of wisdom does not stop at asking questions or searching for answers. For what use is curiosity if it only leads us back to the echo of our own thoughts? True growth demands more. It demands that we open ourselves to the perspectives of others, to voices that challenge us, to truths that may feel uncomfortable at first, but are necessary for our transformation. Wisdom cannot flourish in isolation. It grows in the soil of dialogue, in the exchange of ideas, in the courage to say, "I may not see the whole picture. Let me listen to you." In ancient Athens, this principle was lived out in the agora, the public square. Citizens gathered not only to trade goods but also to exchange ideas. Socrates walked among them, asking his questions not in private chambers but in the open air, where anyone could challenge him or be challenged. He believed that truth was not the possession of a single man, but the product of many minds colliding, testing, refining. And in those debates, wisdom was born, not because one person claimed superiority, but because each admitted the possibility of learning from the other. This is what openness gives us: the humility to recognize that no one sees everything clearly, but together we see more than we ever could alone. The ancient tradition of dialogue was not unique to Greece. In India, for centuries, spiritual seekers engaged in shastrathas, deep philosophical debates that often lasted for days. These were not petty arguments designed to humiliate opponents, but sacred conversations meant to uncover the truth. Each participant came prepared not only to defend their view, but also to learn from the wisdom of others. The great universities of Nalanda and Takshashila became centers of learning precisely because they welcomed diverse voices from across Asia and beyond. Imagine if those scholars had closed their doors to outside perspectives. The richness of their wisdom would have withered, their knowledge confined and limited. Instead, because they were open, knowledge flourished. History also teaches us the danger of refusing openness. Consider the story of Emperor Qin Shi Huang of China. Though he unified vast lands and built the foundations of a mighty empire, his refusal to tolerate dissent or opposing voices led him to burn books and silence scholars. He believed his way was the only way, his knowledge the only truth. For a time his power seemed unstoppable, but his empire did not endure beyond his lifetime. When a leader closes the door to other perspectives, he closes the door to growth, and what cannot grow inevitably crumbles. Contrast this with leaders like Ashoka of India, who after his conquest of Kalinga turned toward wisdom, not by silencing others, but by listening to the teachings of Buddhism and opening himself to a new way of ruling. His openness transformed him from a conqueror to a compassionate king remembered for peace and justice. Openness also requires us to look beyond borders, beyond cultures, beyond the narrow limits of our own upbringing. In the ancient world, knowledge traveled along the Silk Road as much as silk and spices did. Ideas from Greece reached India. Indian mathematics traveled to the Middle East. Arab scholars preserved and expanded upon Greek philosophy before passing it into Europe. Each culture had a fragment of truth, but it was in the sharing, the blending, and the openness to foreign thought that humanity leapt forward. Imagine if the Greeks had dismissed Indian numerals as irrelevant, or if Arab scholars had refused to translate Aristotle's works. Much of what we now call civilization would never have been born. But being open is not always easy. It requires humility, patience, and courage. It is easier to dismiss what we do not understand than to wrestle with it. It is easier to cling to our own perspective than to admit another person might reveal something we cannot see. Yet the greatest teachers of history always modeled openness. Even Confucius, whose wisdom shaped an entire civilization, often said, "When I walk along with two others, they may serve me as my teachers." He did not claim mastery over all knowledge, but looked for wisdom in everyone he met. That is the essence of openness, to see every human being as a potential teacher. Openness also protects us from the arrogance that curiosity alone can sometimes bring. A curious mind may still fall into pride if it only seeks to confirm what it already believes. But when we open ourselves to perspectives different from our own, we learn the discipline of humility again. We learn that even the person we disagree with most passionately may hold a fragment of truth. We learn that wisdom is not a solitary possession, but a shared journey. And when we fail to practice openness, history shows us the consequences. Ancient rulers who surrounded themselves with flatterers, unwilling to hear criticism, often brought ruin upon themselves and their people. Consider King Xerxes of Persia, who ignored wise counsel before invading Greece. His refusal to listen to alternative perspectives led his armies into disaster, proving that arrogance in leadership can devastate entire nations. Yet those who welcomed diverse voices, like Marcus Aurelius, who filled his journal with reflections drawn from philosophers, soldiers, and everyday experiences, left behind wisdom that still guides us today. The openness to perspectives is not about abandoning our beliefs or living without conviction. It is about testing what we know, refining it, and allowing it to grow. Just as iron sharpens iron, so one mind sharpens another. And in that sharpening, truth becomes clear. Without openness, wisdom becomes rigid and brittle. With openness, it becomes flexible, enduring, alive. So, we must carry forward not only humility and curiosity, but also this courage to listen, to consider, to embrace perspectives beyond our own. Only then does wisdom expand beyond the narrow walls of the self and become something greater. But as we journey further, we must also be mindful of a great danger. While openness expands us, arrogance threatens to shrink us again. If humility is forgotten, if curiosity becomes pride, if openness is replaced by stubbornness, we fall into the very trap that destroys wisdom. And that is why the next step in this path is to guard ourselves against arrogance, the silent enemy that blinds even the brightest minds and the strongest leaders. Openness allows wisdom to grow, but there is always a shadow that follows us on this journey, waiting to pull us away from the light. That shadow is arrogance. Arrogance is subtle. It creeps in when we begin to think we have seen enough, learned enough, understood enough. It whispers that we no longer need to question, no longer need to listen, no longer need to admit our limits. It blinds us by convincing us that we see clearly. And the danger of arrogance is not simply that it halts learning, but that it destroys the very foundation upon which wisdom is built. History is filled with examples of arrogance bringing ruin. Take the story of Xerxes of Persia, who believed his empire was invincible. He gathered a massive army to invade Greece, confident that sheer numbers would crush his opponents. Advisors warned him, experience from past battles cautioned him. But arrogance silenced every voice. At Salamis, his navy was trapped and destroyed, and his campaign collapsed. The might of Persia was not defeated by lack of strength, but by the arrogance of its ruler. The lesson is clear. Wisdom cannot survive in a heart that refuses humility. Arrogance blinds even the brightest. Consider the philosopher who believes his system of thought is perfect, complete, needing no refinement. Once he closes himself off to challenge, he ceases to be a philosopher and becomes a prisoner of his own pride. In ancient times, Many schools of thought rose with brilliance, but faded quickly because their leaders believed they had achieved ultimate truth. The Stoics, however, endured because their philosophy reminded its students that life itself is uncertain, that we must constantly test ourselves against reality. They did not claim perfection, and because of that humility, their wisdom survived. Arrogance, by contrast, always leads to collapse. Even great civilizations have crumbled under the weight of arrogance. Ancient Rome, at the height of its power, began to believe it was untouchable. Leaders ignored the lessons of history, indulged in excess, silenced criticism, and assumed their empire would last forever. Yet arrogance made them blind to decay within. What the Romans refused to see became their undoing. The truth is timeless. Arrogance weakens us from within long before enemies can weaken us from without. Arrogance is not only the danger of kings and empires, it is the danger of every individual. When we stop listening to others, when we dismiss perspectives different from our own, when we refuse to admit mistakes, arrogance has taken root. And like a poison, it spreads quietly until it consumes everything. That is why the ancient sages always warned against it. In the Indian epic Mahabharata, Duryodhana's arrogance blinded him to the wisdom of elders and led his family to destruction. In contrast, those who humbled themselves, even after mistakes, found the chance for redemption. The stories remind us that arrogance is not simply a flaw, it is the destroyer of peace, harmony, and growth. But why is arrogance so dangerous? Because it stops movement. Wisdom is a journey, not a destination. When arrogance convinces us that we have already arrived, we stop walking. We stop seeking. We stop growing. A tree that ceases to grow begins to rot, and so does the human spirit when arrogance shuts the door on learning. Even in the lives of great thinkers, we see this pattern. Socrates, the man who declared he knew nothing, was accused and condemned by leaders whose arrogance could not tolerate his questions. They believed their authority was unquestionable, their knowledge beyond challenge. But while their arrogance silenced his body, it could not silence his wisdom, because humility and truth endure long after arrogance collapses. The arrogance of his accusers is forgotten, but the humility of Socrates is remembered forever. Arrogance also robs us of relationships. When we become convinced that we are always right, we stop hearing others. Families, communities, and societies fracture under the weight of pride. Ancient rulers who surrounded themselves with flatterers often perished because they cut themselves off from honest voices. Yet those who welcomed correction, who admitted mistakes, often thrived. Marcus Aurelius, one of Rome's greatest emperors, kept a journal not of his victories but of his struggles, constantly reminding himself to remain humble. He wrote not to boast, but to discipline his own heart against arrogance. That is the true mark of a wise leader. Not the absence of power, but the restraint to wield it with humility. If arrogance is the enemy, how do we guard against it? By continually returning to the practices of humility, curiosity, and openness. By reminding ourselves that every moment holds something new to learn, that every person we meet carries a story we do not know, that every challenge contains a lesson we may not yet understand. Arrogance cannot live where the spirit of learning thrives. The moment we say, "I have no more to learn," arrogance grows. But the moment we say, "Teach me," wisdom continues its journey. And perhaps the most important way to resist arrogance is to recognize that wisdom is never complete. It is a lifelong path, one that cannot be fully traveled in a single lifetime. Ancient seekers understood this. Diogenes, the cynic, carried a lantern in broad daylight, searching for an honest man. Whether he ever found one was not the point. The point was that he never stopped searching. His humility kept him seeking truth until his last breath. That is the antidote to arrogance. The acceptance that the journey has no final destination, only endless steps forward. So as we reflect, we see the pattern. Humility opens the door. Curiosity drives us forward. Openness allows us to learn from others. And arrogance threatens to close everything. But wisdom survives when we resist pride and keep moving. And this movement shows us the final truth. Wisdom is not something to be possessed and completed, but something to be pursued for as long as we live. It is not a prize to be held but a path to be walked. That is why the next step is to embrace wisdom not as an end, but as a lifelong journey, one that continues through every stage of life and invites us never to stop seeking. When we understand that arrogance destroys and humility preserves, we come face to face with the greatest truth of all: wisdom is not a destination, it is a lifelong journey. Too many people imagine wisdom as a treasure to be found once, like a hidden jewel buried beneath the earth. They believe that if they study enough, read enough, or live long enough, they will one day hold wisdom completely in their hands. But the ancients remind us that wisdom is not a jewel to be discovered, but a path to be walked. It is not about arriving at a final answer, but about continuing to ask the questions that deepen our understanding of life. Think of Socrates, who even in his final moments did not claim to possess the truth, but continued his search. He never said, "I have found it all." Instead, he modeled a life of endless pursuit. That is why his legacy still inspires us. He showed that wisdom is not about what we hold, but about what we seek. It is in the daily effort, the ongoing practice, the continual openness to learn. The journey itself becomes the treasure. In ancient Greece, the image of the philosopher was not of someone who sat once with a book and became wise, but of someone who lived each day in reflection. Plato, the student of Socrates, described the human soul as turning toward the light, like a prisoner leaving the shadows of a cave. The journey from darkness to light is not a single step, but an ongoing movement, each day bringing new clarity. The cave is not escaped once for all, it is escaped little by little, as long as one keeps moving. Other civilizations echoed the same truth. In Buddhism, wisdom is spoken of as a path, not a possession. The Eightfold Path is not a trophy to display, but a way of living to be walked daily. The enlightened ones were those who continued practicing, continued seeking balance, compassion, and understanding through every stage of life. Their wisdom was not something static but something alive, growing, evolving. That is why even the Buddha himself urged his followers not to accept his words blindly, but to test them, to walk the path for themselves. This shows us that true wisdom can never be completed, it must be lived again and again, step by step, day by day. In ancient India, the sages of the Upanishads also described life as a journey toward truth. They believed that knowledge was like crossing a river. Each question, each practice, each meditation carried a person further across, but the river was wide, and the crossing was lifelong. Some reached only a little. But what mattered was not how much was crossed, but that the seeker continued to walk, continued to strive, continued to grow. The humility of lifelong pursuit was considered more valuable than the arrogance of declaring, "I have arrived." Even in leadership, the wisest rulers were those who understood that their wisdom had to grow with them. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, could have claimed he had reached the peak of power and knowledge. Instead, he spent his nights writing in his journal, reminding himself that life was short, that each day was an opportunity to improve, that wisdom had to be practiced constantly. His writings reveal not a man who believed he had found every answer, but a man who knew he must keep searching within himself. This is why his meditations endure, not as a final declaration, but as a record of a lifelong journey. When we embrace wisdom as a journey, we protect ourselves from stagnation. We recognize that no matter how much we know today, tomorrow can teach us more. We learn to value experience not as a final lesson, but as one chapter in a longer story. We see failures not as the end, but as necessary teachers along the way. We realize that every encounter, every challenge, every success, and every loss is part of our education. Life itself becomes our greatest teacher when we commit to learning without end. And this is the most empowering truth, because wisdom is a journey, it is never too late to begin. The young and the old, the student and the teacher, the ruler and the servant, all are travelers on the same road. There is no shame in starting late, for the road has no end. There is no pride in thinking we have reached the end, for the road stretches further still. What matters is not where we are on the path, but that we keep moving. When Diogenes walked through Athens with a lantern in daylight, searching for an honest man, people laughed at him. Yet his lantern was not just a symbol of cynicism. It was a reminder that the search never ends. To seek truth, to seek honesty, to seek wisdom is a task for every hour of life. And whether we ever find the perfect answer is not as important as whether we continue to search. So let us remember, humility sets us on the path, curiosity moves us forward, openness broadens our steps, The rejection of arrogance keeps us steady, and the commitment to the lifelong journey ensures we never stop growing. This is why Socrates' words still echo through time. I know that I know nothing. They are not words of despair but of power, for they remind us that life is an endless opportunity to learn, to expand, to become more than we were yesterday. True wisdom begins there, but it does not end there. It continues as long as we breathe, and perhaps even beyond.